So as per usual, health and wellness, very important discussion. It takes up the majority of the second hour on a Tuesday, and we welcome TNT's favorite doc, Dr. Saf, joins me to break down this week's Health Plus inside our guardian. Dr. Saf, great to see you as always.
Good morning, Jason. Good morning, Trinidad and Tobago. And continuing in the vein from our previous conversation with Dr. LeBlanc, mental health. In the last couple of weeks, in the last couple of years, we've been going through so many emotional tolls, so many disasters. Last week was flooding. The last 2.5 years was COVID. A couple of weeks ago, we're following the death of the persons with the Titan divers. But every day, we're moving through different stressors. And we're not realizing how those dominoes are piling and the emotional toll it's building upon us.
Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. We always hear about that with soldiers. We hear about it with folks who would have gone through some kind of life-altering, life-changing situation. People who would have been, let's say, in an accident. I've always heard that coming out of that, if they're in a taxi or they're not behind, they're not controlling the wheel, and someone is speeding, you're going to a place of stress. You're almost...
You're triggered. You're hyper-aroused.
That is the word.
That's exactly what we broke down in today's Guardian Health Plus. Jason, it's so important that we recognize that trauma, they're big T's, loss of life, loss of financial situation, but they're little T's. And those little T's, even something like that, reliving the trauma, is also can elicit that dramatic response in our emotional health.
Could someone who would have been impacted by crime
of course. So again, today we looked at some of those traumas: crime, abuse, violence in the home, even hearing shouting, and today in the Health Plus article, we talk specifically about our aged population and our children, our high risk, because children perceive trauma, they perceive threats in a different way. So let's just go through what would have happened, say, with the flooding last week. Children may have heard, children mirror the way parents engage and the way the parents react to things. If there was any loss of life or loss of things at the home, they may feel that anxiety and mirror it. Let's say if there was an accident and there's loss of life in particular, they may now have that trauma. Suppose that happens to somebody I love, and that stays with them. Even in terms of the diving, they may feel, well, that trauma can stay with them. They may not want to go to the beach again, things like that. So there are different levels of trauma: loss of life, accident, trauma in terms of violence, financial means, a host of traumas.
I want to take it back to that point of violence and crime, because we have found ourselves in a place in Trinidad where it's been around for so long that I've seen two schools of thought with it. I've seen people who are very cautious. They are literally, they feel that trauma of the said crime, so they are going through certain emotional issues, mental issues. They are triggered by certain things, so they have altered their life. And there are many others who have realized they are almost numb to crime and violence. Sometimes it might even come to their doorstep, and you see them able to just pick up and move on like it never happened. It's almost like it's been normalized, as it were. Is that also a way of coping?
So that is probably their way of coping, because the person who is constantly triggered, they are living in that trauma cycle. And you would want them to have some level of desensitization, but not to the point where they become completely not vigilant of it, right? So yes, coping, and you mentioned a very important word there. Mental health early on is developing your coping techniques, those strategies, that support network. How do you bounce back? And that's why we specifically looked at this topic, post-traumatic stress disorder, in terms of breaking down some of the signs and symptoms. Back to the children, they do not know how to communicate their anxiety, but children may now start to, unfortunately, you may see a 10-year-old, 11-year-old bedwetting. They may become aggressive, changes in behavior. And when you sit down and have the conversation, that's the key to it all. Be it the parent or be it a loved one, you'd realize it's trauma.
I saw via the article here in the Health Plus, you're suggesting that families create a disaster and recovery plan. Walk me through that. How do we even get that conversation going?
And this is what is so crucial. We must move our family unit, our business unit, to a place of preparedness, our country, to a place of preparedness. Rather than this reactive lifestyle that we live, let's move it to proactive. So let's talk about this disaster plan. Working in the ICU previously, we literally go through, not that you can predict every single circumstance and possible event, but you literally go through step by step. If something happens, if the situation around you, your home floods out, where are your documents, where your where's your medications? So you literally want to go through step by step what the family unit would do. If there's complete loss of power, what do we do with the food items? If one has to walk through the water, there's the possibility of leptospirosis. Every single time after flooding, our ER is now flooded with patients who exhibit leptospirosis. Our diabetic patients, those who have sores on their feet, they absolutely, well, no one should be walking through floodwater, none whatsoever, but more so if you have a wound on your feet. So we see this upsurgence of those cases.
I want to open the lines, and while we open the lines, I want to bring another issue to the table. Of course, the number is 624-8721 and 627-8658. Feel free, talk to Dr. Saf. She's here, ready to field your question. And a matter of fact, we'll take a break before the calls, but really quick, and probably you could soak this in, and when we come back, we'll look out for the response. What about those who self-diagnose?
Yes.
They turn to a substance to numb the pain, or you go through total avoidance. You know, you do like if it never happened at all. I want you to probably give a brief answer on it, and we could go a little more in depth when we come back after the break.
We certainly need to go deeper when we talk about avoidance, because avoidance or numbing the pain is an unhealthy coping mechanism. It is a coping mechanism. It's one of the stages, but it's absolutely unhealthy, because that trauma, once it has happened, if one doesn't go through the process of it, it will re-emerge, and it can actually re-emerge in much more destructive ways. And that's where we want to, that's why we're bringing these topics to the forefront, to let one know, be more aware of what some of these signs and symptoms are.
We'll let you elaborate some more, Dr. Saf, after the break, and we will open the lines. Feel free to touch base, 624-8721 and 627-8658. So we continue with the Health Plus discussion, 624-8721 and 627-8658. You were suggesting before we took the break, Dr. Saf, that avoidance, coping mechanisms, people who might self-subscribe, take whatever to just, I guess, escape the reality of the day. You're saying that ultimately going down that road might work for today, but tomorrow is when an issue could really come up, and that could be detrimental.
Those are unhealthy behaviors, unhealthy coping mechanisms. Really and truly, one must be able to face that trauma step by step, process if need be. Seek, and this is why we are having these conversations, normalizing that it's okay to not be okay, and seek further help in terms of therapy. I believe there's a call on the line.
Yeah, there's someone on the line. Good morning, and talk to Dr. Saf. Welcome.
Hi, good day, Jason. Jason, how it is, Sheldon?
Hey, welcome.
Hi, doctor. How are you?
Good morning.
I just want to state, and I want you to tell the population why it's important to deal with the issue at hand than to run from it. And most time, what I observe about people in general, they tend to run from it. But if they don't deal with it, as the doctor stated, it's going to get worse. So the best mode of action is dealing with it. Doctor, could you give some of your expertise on that topic, why dealing with it is very important?
Thank you so much, caller. And he just re-emphasized exactly what we're talking about, that it's important to process it in the moment. So that trauma doesn't live within the system and then re-traumatize later on, or unfortunately build these unhealthy coping mechanisms, unhealthy mechanisms. That trauma may also, it's like energy. You know, they say energy, it moves into different forms. It actually translates and transforms. That trauma may build into, unfortunately, and convert into violence later on.
That's true.
Yeah.
Who's on the line? Let's see who's there, and you're ready to talk to Dr. Saf. She's standing by. Good morning. Hi,
good morning.
Morning.
Good morning. We didn't hear clearly.
Say that again. I didn't hear you clear.
Can I give her the morning please?
You know, I'm making up
right, that's okay. But we want, the reason we, again, having these conversations is to bring awareness, knowing it's so important, just like the previous caller talked about, seeking that next step, seeking the help, knowing that it's okay to seek therapy, seek the help of a mental health expert. Having worked in the ICU, in the neonatal ICU, we saw so many cases where persons would have experienced end of life. That's another case of trauma that can remain deep-seated. Even earlier, as Dr. Asante LeBlanc talking about the diagnosis, when one gets a diagnosis of cancer, Jason, that in itself can traumatize the family. And it's so important developing these resilient coping mechanisms. And that's why in today's Health Plus, we looked at this disaster plan, your preparedness plan, not just for emergencies, not just for disasters as big as flooding. Now that's important because we are going into the rainy season. We're going to see what we saw last week much more later on. And it's important we put our families in a place of a recovery plan.
You know, it's so important because I think ultimately what we're seeing here this morning is to face the music, have these hard discussions. Sometimes people tend to, again, we talk about avoidance.
Yeah.
You avoid any kind of heavy topic. You're not going to touch on it at all. You treat with it as it comes your way, but sometimes it's too much. It's too overwhelming when it takes place, if indeed it ever takes place at all. So this whole concept of, yes, time will heal the wound, but sometimes it's important, as you have suggested, to address this issue. I'll let you close things off in the remaining minute we have.
And you know, addressing the situation, awareness, acknowledging. I refer back to the ICU, ABCs, right? We would say airway, breathing, circulation. But in this situation, awareness, be understanding those beliefs that will now affect your later situation, those biases. And C, most importantly, having the courage to take those very important next steps. Knowing, being aware, understanding what beliefs and biases will affect your decisions, and most importantly, that courage to take the next step. It's okay if one is going through a traumatic situation. Seek those that help that next step, and as we always talk about right here on Health Plus, be proactive in your every step.
Awareness, belief, courage, your ABCs as put together there with excellence every single week by Dr. Saf. I want to thank you, Dr. Saf. God spare we do it again next week via our Health Plus. Get your copy today inside The Guardian. And as per usual, thank you for tuning in. Have a great one, have a safe one, have a dry one. We might have some